we're all having this human experience, and leaders, just like everybody else, most of them have been on a long, hard road like we all are. So I think that ability to reflect on your experiences with some humility and think about the lessons you've learned and how you can pass those along is part of the mark of a great leader.
Hello and welcome to the Innovative Mindset Podcast. I'm your host, Isolde Trachtenberg. On the show, I interview peak-performing innovators in the creative, social impact, and earth conservation spaces who are working to change the world. This episode is brought to you by Brain FM. Brain FM combines the best of music and neuroscience to help you relax, focus, meditate, and even sleep. I love it and have been using it to write, create, and do some of my deepest work. Because you're a listener of the show, you can get a free trial. Head over to brain.fm/innovative mindset to check it out. If you decide to subscribe, you can get 20% off with the coupon code Innovative Mindset, all one word. And now, let's get to the show. Hey there, and welcome to the Innovative Mindset Podcast. My name is Isolde Trachtenberg. I'm super thrilled you're here. I'm thrilled and honored to have this week's guest on the show. Check this out. Suzanne Bates is Managing Director and Partner at BTS, a global leadership firm based in Sweden. Suzanne came to BTS in an acquisition as founder and CEO of Bates. She pioneered new approaches to communicative leadership. Don't you love that phrase, communicative leadership? I love that, including the first research-based assessment of executive presence and a breakthrough model of how teams perform. Suzanne is an innovative entrepreneur who came to business through a circuitous route as a television news anchor and reporter. She's the author of 4 books on leadership, including Speak Like a CEO, a McGraw-Hill business classic. Suzanne, thank you so much for being here. Welcome.
Thanks, Isola. Great to be with you.
Let me ask you, first of all, I'm dying to find out how you moved from being a news anchor and a reporter to the CEO of your own company and becoming an author. What was the route that you took? You said it's circuitous, which I think is lovely, but how did that happen? What was the inspiration?
Well, interestingly, you don't learn much about business when you're a journalist unless you're a business reporter. So I can say that I had almost no background in business when I started my company, but I did have a desire to change my life and go in a different direction. And I had a father who was kind of an entrepreneur as well. So, I think I was looking for a change and to make a different impact in the world. I loved being a journalist for the time that I was in that role for 20 years. It was a lot of fun. And what I often say to people is I highly recommend changing careers at least once in your life. It's so refreshing to discover what you never knew about yourself.
I love that. And it's interesting, isn't it, how those hidden talents or those interests that you might have had years and years ago can come to the forefront as you get older, as you're ready for changes. So when you did that, when you made those changes, you decided to focus on leadership. And I love that. I love focusing on leadership because leaders help everything go. What about leadership fascinated you enough that it was the thing you wanted to focus on?
I was fortunate enough, Isolde, to have the opportunity when I first started my company to work with some really powerful and inspiring leaders. I was able to do that work because they knew me from television and because they trusted that I could help them communicate. And, that's something you don't learn in business school, right? You don't learn how to communicate in a powerful way with your important audiences, and you get promoted to the top because of your business and financial acumen. So it was a nice opportunity for me to get introduced to some very senior people. And, I guess I just would say I wanted to understand what made them so great and also what enabled others to develop into leaders. And one of the things that I discovered right away is that the best leaders invest in their own development throughout their lives. They're lifelong learners. And they're always seeking. There's a combination of confidence and humility, and that was actually one of the first things that I noticed about the leaders I admired, and ultimately was built into the model of executive presence that we created.
I'm taking all that in for a second. It's fascinating to me because that notion of being humble, I get, but there's another part of this that I think that you started touching on that I'd love to delve into a little bit deeper. This is, after all, the Innovative Mindset podcast, right? So there seems to be needed a sort of open-mindedness, a need to learn, and a need to perhaps try things differently in order for things to see what will work. So I'd love it if you'd talk a little bit about what those methods might be for leaders, that they are lifelong learners. They read, for example, or something like that. I think Buffett says he reads a book a week or something.
Mm-hmm.
What do leaders do to learn? And how do they then pass those teachings down to their teams?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, leaders are different and they learn differently, just like all of us do. But I think what differentiates the best ones is that they learn to reflect on what their experiences and to
Mm.
take lessons away from those experiences. And those are the experiences that shape them and make them who they are. And when they're able to communicate that in an authentic way, they're really able to connect with others, because we're all having this human experience, and leaders, just like everybody else, most of them have been on a long hard road like we all are. So I think that ability to reflect on your experiences with some humility and think about the lessons you've learned and how you can pass those along is part of the mark of a great leader.
I am still here. I'm just, it's interesting to me, this notion, bringing, because we often think our leaders breathe rarefied air, right? We forget that they are just like us. So like you said, we're all living this human experience. And yet in leadership, in business, in any kind of work, in any kind of an organization, you need to have some metrics, right? You need to figure out how if what you're doing is working, right? So these leaders pass this knowledge, these methods, these ideas on to their teams. But then how do you find out if it's working, if what you're doing is improving your team and improving everybody's performance, and also I'll say it, their human experience?
Yeah. The hardest part of being a leader, I think, is that you really don't get very much feedback. The higher you go, the more insulated you are, and the less likely people are to tell you what they really think or
Mm.
to challenge your ideas. And so it takes a special leader to open up to uh, other people's ideas, not just criticism, but because when you get promoted up and up the ranks, you can like a professional athlete, pretty soon you think you're in rarefied air, and you are, right, and that you maybe you're infallible, and that can be reinforced when people don't speak up or share their ideas. So leaders who I want to tackle your question in two ways. Leaders who lead innovation, for example, are actually not the ones with the best ideas or the most innovative. They're the ones that create an environment where people can innovate. And
Mm.
what
Mm.
that means really is creating an environment of psychological safety where they are humble enough to ask really good questions. So part of the mark of a great leader, I think, is they ask great questions and they really listen. And through that process, they create an interactive, constructive conversation where people aren't afraid to experiment or say, this is how I see it. So, in that way, I think leaders open up to others' ideas. Now, how do you encourage that? I really believe, and one of the reasons, not to go right to the assessment, one of the reasons I was really interested in creating a 360 assessment of executive presence, which is really a leadership model,
Mm.
is because I think that leaders often don't get feedback on aspects of leadership like humility or authenticity or integrity. And people often ask me, well, how can you measure those things? Well, you can measure them through feedback. You can measure them by how people rate you on certain types of behaviors that are connected to humility or integrity or authenticity. And when leaders get that data, it's inspiring to them, and it's also painful sometimes. But
Mm.
they get much more information about the impact they're having, which is coming all the way back around to the question that you asked, Zola, which is how do they know? You know by measuring it and by asking the people around you to how you doing.
Oh, that's simple. I love that. It's funny. Tom Peters was on the show a little while ago, and he was talking about something in his book, The Excellence Dividend, where I believe it was HP when they went to Hewlett Packard, he and his writing partner, and met with the CEO. They went on a walk of the company, and the CEO kept stopping by and going, "Hey, how you doing?" and asking the various employees that they passed how things were going. And what he described it as was leadership by wandering around. And I thought that was fascinating that he was down with everybody, sort of boots on the ground, really thinking and asking and talking about how things were going with the people who worked for him. So I'm wondering, when you're talking about this assessment, which sounds amazing, by the way, how do the employees feel comfortable enough to give honest feedback? What kind of parameters are set so that the leader gets to hear it, but also that the employees have the confidence that it's okay to speak up?
Yeah, that's such a powerful question. The most 360 assessments are set up so that there are groups of raters like your peers, your direct reports, your boss, others. And so they're lumped together in a group. And even though typically, at least in our assessment, the leader invites people to participate so part of that question is inviting people to be candid and forthcoming in their comments and their scoring.
Mm-hmm.
And once the leader gives permission for that, and that could be whether you're doing a 360 or whether you're just having a conversation, that is the first step. The second step is their comments are anonymous, their scores are anonymous. However, we also encourage leaders to go back to, we call them their raters. So the people who participate in a survey like that
Mm-hmm.
and have meaningful conversations with them. Well, again, you have to set a psychologically safe environment to have that conversation. So what sometimes people want to do when they get feedback is say, well, what do you mean? I've tried to do this. I'm misunderstood, et cetera, et cetera. And what we have to do as leaders and really as people, any of us who are seeking feedback or wanting to get better at what we do is make it safe for people to say what they really think and to listen with respect and not respond until we've had time to process. That is an art.
Absolutely. Not just an art, but it takes, I imagine, a fair amount of emotional intelligence to be able to, as a leader, go, okay, I'm going to sit here and I'm going to, despite the fact that I might want to be defensive, like you said, that I might want to go, but wait, you as a leader would have to sort of sit there and go, okay, I'm going to approach, I guess, in an attitude of receptivity, I guess,
Yeah.
and how, because most leaders aren't taught to be receptive. Most leaders are taught you must quote unquote lead. So how would a leader prepare, or is there a way that you help them prepare, and if so, what is it, to be receptive to things that they might not want to hear?
Yeah. Well, the truth is very few of us like to hear, negative feedback, and
Sure.
it's hard to hear. And interestingly, we measure two qualities of leadership called composure and restraint.
Mm.
And we find in the model, in the assessment, when we look at thousands and thousands of pieces of data, that those are the two lowest rated facets for leaders. In
Mm.
other words, they tend to be more reactive. They tend to be, maybe get upset, right? Composure is in the moment,
Mm.
how you deal with a crisis. And restraint is sort of your demeanor as how you're built, right? Uh, so if we are low in composure and low in restraint, and many of us are, we have to teach ourselves some techniques. I mean, the old count to 10 still works, right? Count to 10 before you respond, take a
Tried and
breath,
true, right?
walk away, don't respond to the email right away. ask for some time to think about, that we know what we're supposed to do. It's a matter of, can we manage our emotions in the moment to do that so that we are able to show up as our best selves when we do re-engage. So, it's a quality of, I think, advanced, mature, personhood and leadership,
Mhm.
to be able to feel the emotion and still tell yourself intellectually to wait.
Yeah, it's interesting when I speak at organizations and at companies, we talk about the difference between reaction and response, and that difference is how many breaths you take between what happens and what you do about it, right? So that notion of walking away, of taking a breath, in some ways it's tried and true. In some ways we've been talking about that for a very long time, probably, before written history. Don't throw that rock, walk away before you throw the rock. So what do we do now in a time when things are everything's crunchy? We're all a little burnt out with COVID and everything. What do we do now, not just for leaders perhaps, but as people, to come back to that and yet innovate through it so that we are able to get that emotional distance to hear things? Do you have any approaches that will help someone do that, other than the, yes, we're tried and true? How are you advocating for that development of emotional intelligence?
Yeah. Well, there's a much greater recognition today about the role that emotional intelligence plays in leadership. So there's much more conversation about it. There's more development, I think, happening generally in that area. And that's a very broad statement. But I think our generation of leaders, if you will, and the next generation of leaders, are a little more aware. But COVID and working remotely has really challenged us. And
Mm.
I'm working right now on some work on teaming with a couple of other partners, thought leaders. And teaming is, teams of teams working together, which is really, how work gets done. And there's a lot of misunderstanding about um, what role emotional intelligence plays in the work of teams as well. So,
Hmm.
for example, conflict is good, right? Conflict is not something we should avoid. And in COVID and in remote work, sometimes we're less likely to engage in constructive conflict. So in the attempt to reserve or not show emotion or not react, sometimes we can overdo that and not have the conversations that we need to have. And all this has been made much more difficult by remote work, which is here to stay. So I think that what's going to change, or what's going to evolve, is a very good question, because we're living in a time when, especially in North America and the US in particular, the political and social environment is so polarized,
Mm.
and people are already worn down by that, that they're becoming afraid just generally to have a conversation. So while that might make things seem more okay on the surface, it actually creates failure in organizations, a failure to deal with what's real, and differences of ideas, and different people seeing things through different lenses. And we're going to have to teach ourselves to do that.
Oh, wow. Okay. Again, you're dropping a lot of wisdom, Suzanne, and I'm so grateful, but you're giving me so much to think about that I'm going, I need to get myself together and ask the question that I need to ask here, and that is, how do we do that? How do we make those inroads to learn that? Because it is, like you said, location independence is here to stay in some ways. So how do we corral that and make it a workable model moving forward?
Yeah. There's another quality of leadership, and I think, humanness, called resonance, also a social emotional quality of leadership. And resonance is the ability to not just be with somebody and understand, but to anticipate in leadership how something might feel for them, how they might receive it, how they might interpret it, how, the impact that that might have on them. And leaders with a high level of resonance, in other words, the ability to think, not just before they speak, but as they're making decisions, whether that decision has to be made or not, to think about the impact it's going to have on others. And also to think deeply when they hear, maybe in the distance, they hear about something going on, to want to explore that further, to understand how are people really thinking and feeling. Before it rises to the level of a crisis is, that's again, it's a very mature level of leadership. So I would say, it's hard to say as a human race how we're going to develop that. But I think if you're thinking about how you develop that in yourself, it's we need time to pause and to think, and we need to think about others. We need to think about how they might um, what impact something might have on them. And look, none of us is perfect. You know Recently, we've been very, very fortunate on our own team. We've had a really, really long time employees who've stayed with us and love working with us. But we did have somebody leave recently, and we knew it was going to have a big impact on the rest of the team. And, if the simplest things, I mean, you've got to schedule meetings with them, you've got to call them and talk to them and take the time to do that. And, I think sometimes we believe as leaders, we don't have time to do that because we do have so much to do. But if we don't take that step, then the rest of it doesn't matter. I mean, executing your strategy isn't going to happen if people in your organization aren't engaged and aligned and loving working there. So, if you don't take care of the people, you don't have a business.
Absolutely. I recently had Norm Snyder, who is the CEO of Reed's Inc., if you know them, the ginger beer company. And he said that his notion about being a leader is that part of his job was to make sure that every employee who works at the company knows they're important and wants to be there. He said those are the two big things that he looks for as far as the relationships among the employees and the employees to him as their CEO, that he wants them to want to be there is one of the most important aspects of their jobs. So once again, I find, every time I talk to a leader like you and like Norm, we end up in that space of we want to make sure that the culture of our organization or company is such that employees feel safe and they feel happy where they are and they feel confident coming to me if there's a problem. And so this is a huge question, but how do we support that? How does a leader who wants to remain on that cutting edge and be innovative support that kind of culture?
Well, you model it from the top, of course. And, if any leader who speaks like that about how important people are in the culture can model it, and those who get it are going to get it. And, I like to say, and, if you think about leading a team of people and trying to encourage those leaders to act in similar ways toward their folks, um, a wise person once said to me, didn't come from me, but culture is the worst behavior you'll tolerate.
Oh my. That's a very fascinating way of looking at it, and I both love it and hate it, I have to say. So within that, modeling it from the top, you as someone who works with leaders, you have in some ways probably a tough job when you come up against a leader who doesn't have that, as you put it, mature and developed way of looking at things. What kind of innovations do you encourage in a leader who perhaps isn't ready to lead in this way?
You know, that changing ourselves in any way is hard. And, the way I always look at every leader as, I don't look at people as broken. There are some leaders who've really gone off the path, and there are some people who don't belong in those jobs at all. But it's the job of the organization to know the difference
Mm.
and not to allow people who are way off course for whatever reason to be in a position of leading others. At the same time, I think that we can all go a little off course. And so usually I find with leaders who have, the right stuff, have what it takes, may have fallen into some bad habits, or they might be over rotating on qualities like confidence that have gotten them this far. But the old Marshall Goldsmith saying, what got you here won't get you there. They've gotten this far, but it's not working for them anymore. And getting feedback on those behaviors is part of what motivates them. And you might call that a mindset shift. So opening yourself up to a feedback and then receiving that feedback and understanding the impact that it's having on others for many really good leaders is a strong motivator. And then all they need are some, some tips or tricks or, ways of just reminding themselves. I have a colleague who recommended to a guy once that he just take a sticky and put a question mark on it and stick it on his phone to remind him to ask people at least 2 questions when they called him. And he said it worked like a charm. I mean, there was that sticky, and he wanted to change, but he just needed the reminder. So, motivation is a big part of it. And, sometimes if we're talking to the organization and they're evaluating someone for succession and they tell us that they're, maybe more trouble, right? But they sell a lot, or, whatever it is, they're technical geniuses. I think one of the roles of, in this case, a coach or an advisor is still to ask the question, at what cost? And do you think you can save this person?
Ah,
Because, right? I mean, sometimes, somebody just isn't ready, to make
right.
those changes.
Right. No, absolutely. And it calls upon, like you've been saying this whole time, this whole conversation, it calls upon a certain maturity, both inside yourself and the organization, to know when it's working and perhaps when it needs help, and perhaps when there's no way to make it work. And then there's a lot of communication that needs to happen in order to make that work. And one of the things that because I love your book, I love Speak Like a CEO, that I've read. I have not read the other 3. And one of the things that you talk about is those communication techniques, both sort of as part of presenting, but also as part of leading effectively. So if you were going to say to me, what are the perhaps 3 top tips that you would give to a leader who needs that receptivity, but at the same time also still needs to communicate? What would you say would be the 3 top things that a leader needs to know in order to communicate in any situation?
First, you need to understand your audience. And that's, going back to resonance. But there are some techniques in Speak Like a CEO we talk about. There's, a tool we call Audience Agenda, where you write down what you want to talk about on the one side of the page, the left, and then you stop and think, well, what does the audience want to know about this? What do they
Mhm.
care about it? How do
Mhm.
they think? So understanding your audience is the essential. It is the first step in it before you ever get up to speak, before you ever put the presentation together. Because the same topic for different audiences is a different presentation in many
Mm.
ways, right?
Mhm.
I say the second would be become a storyteller, and people recoil and they say, "Oh, I'm not a story. I don't know how to tell stories." There's also a method to that. There's a
Mm.
method to everything. My husband wrote a book on how to write the third act of a screenplay. I mean, there's always ways to break it down. And
Right.
we have a method for storytelling for leaders, which is, a 6-part process. So, you need to teach yourself, because people learn through stories, and they connect with you as a human being when they hear about the real life observations you've had. Now, don't make yourself a hero in the story. You got to make other people a hero, right? But what have you learned in your time, on this earth, that, would help connect to them? Uh, I would say the third thing, it sounds kind of basic, but you do have to know the nuts and bolts of communicating. And,
Mm.
in email, what that means is treating people with respect, using a salutation, writing complete sentences, unless you're just chatting back and forth. I mean, that's different and depends on, the culture of the organization, but at the front of the room, you do need to master the techniques of standing up and speaking effectively. I mean, there's a reason why people used to admire. Uh, his name is escaping me. I can't believe it now. But any speaker that you admire, any leader you've seen stand up on stage, they've practiced a lot. They're not a natural at it. There's no such thing as a natural born speaker. It's a skill that you can learn.
Oh, I agree completely. And How to Win Friends and Influence People. When Dale Carnegie was writing that book, he was talking a lot about that notion of being a better speaker means in some ways being a better listener. And I love that. But he also had these tried and true techniques like say the person's name correctly. It's again, like you said, it sounds basic, but these are the kinds of things people love hearing their name and people love hearing their name said correctly. So some of these interesting innovations we seem to be circling back to, if you see what I mean, instead of going, oh, this is brand new. It's actually, no, it's 80 years old, if not much older. Right.
Yeah.
So when we're in that situation, if you're standing up and you're going to be giving uh, any sort of presentation or speech, all of those things make a lot of sense. And yet, is there something that's coming that's new, that's someone who has studied Carnegie and all of the other speaker authors and professionals? Is there something new? Is there a new thing that you might want to offer for someone who goes, oh, I want to do this and I want to do it really well in this new digital, we're all going to be working from home age?
Yeah. Well, there is, I think there's some really, really great innovations in technology for communicating or for interacting, in a conference, not even just Zoom, because a lot of us have gotten used to that, but, becoming adept at that, at using, not just emojis, but, reactions and things like that, or using polling and using other ways of interactivity really is where it's at. So if you
Mm-hmm.
think about uh, the digital age that we're in. In the early phases of it, it was just like everything else. We were talking at people.
Mm-hmm.
And then we realized that that wasn't very interactive. It wasn't a great way to learn. And I mean, one of the things that we've been working on, and it gets a little away from presenting, but just, as a maybe to stimulate the conversation a little bit, when we're, thinking today about how we design our digital learning, in other words, how would I take some of the elements from the speak book that you talked about and teach that in a digital format. You can't just voice over PowerPoint for 15 minutes. Nobody will listen to that anymore. And you can't just sit, I mean, podcasts are beautiful because we're doing other things and it takes us to another place while we're doing those things, whether we're walking or exercising or, sitting by the fire. But when you're learning, you need to be interacting. If it's requiring you to be fully attentive, then we have to ask questions. We have to do knowledge checks. We have to make people feel like they're there, not just,
Sure.
that we've recorded something we expect them to sit and listen to. And similarly, if you're at the front of the room, there's all kinds of audience interactivity now, polling and other things that are becoming even more common, I think. When I speak, I like to, always have liked to make it interactive. So even if it's a keynote, I go out into the audience, I get people to talk in pairs. There's just nothing more boring than watching somebody on stage for an hour. So I think just remember that you're really in speaking, you're creating a conversation and you can actually create conversation, within a presentation in so many ways. And some of them are low tech too, just going out into the crowd like
Right.
Oprah and taking the microphone around is a great way, great interaction.
And you get to talk and you get to talk. Absolutely. Absolutely. I agree wholeheartedly. This notion of interaction to me is key. It's helping people feel valued and valuable in that interaction that I think is amazing. And for you as a news reporter, you've done so many interviews, you've talked to so many people, and that it sounds like it translates to working with leaders. But how did you decide to invest in that in these kinds of innovations?
Well, part of it is necessity. I mean, if you're going to stay relevant and think about thinking about innovation for a moment. I mean, we're at a time in our human history when things are changing so rapidly. It's not just which technology we choose to use, but how we use it
Mm,
and how people use it, and understanding the interaction between technology and people is something I think we're still really just probably on the frontier of. I mean, I don't think I'll live long enough, none of us will, to see where it goes. But
mm.
I think it's exciting to think about, how we really truly make not make technology human, but make it human, not even human like, but just make it work for humans.
Yeah, and there is this fine line I think we're going to be walking as augmented reality and virtual reality become more powerful and more capable of how do we keep it sort of humanized, if you will. And I think, yeah, that's going to be an interesting thing. All the futurists are talking about it. Peter Shankman, Kevin Kelly, all those folks are talking about this notion of what we're going to do later. And yet it sounds to me like you're maintaining this, your flag in the ground is, but we have to keep it human. And what are your thoughts about that? How can we keep it on that human level in conjunction and maybe even despite some of the technology that's being developed?
I think maybe just everything needs a human touch of some kind.
Mm,
If for example, I mean, this is going to be very basic. It's not IA, it's not anything fancy, but if you have digital content you're sharing with a group of people who are learning, right, then that should be followed by human interaction.
mm,
I think, and that's the ideal. So, let's say you're doing sales training, right, and we have a module on how to sell to a C-suite buyer. Great, wonderful. They sit and watch it and they do their knowledge check, and then they get together with their sales manager in a small group, and they talk about a C-suite buyer they'd like to meet and how hard it's been to start up a conversation with them. And
mm.
so they get to talk about it and make it real. And so I think that it's, one of the things that's been hard for kids, and I don't have children school age anymore. My daughter is grown, but I can only imagine how hard it was for them trying to learn virtually when we were so immature in our ability to create real learning in that environment. So, but it was a catalyst, wasn't it? It was a catalyst for us all to realize there's so much more that we can do with technology, as long as we can still keep the human element, whatever that learning is.
Yeah, I agree, and it's going to be an interesting challenge as we move forward. I there I have like 6 hours worth of questions for you, Suzanne, and I know you have a life to get back to. So, I have just a couple more questions if I may. And this is an interesting one, coming back to this notion of keeping the human element and the way leaders need to sort of step up into that. Going back into the mind of the leader for a second, how does a leader, I don't know how to ask this question now that I'm thinking about it, because it really is, if we're going to keep that human element, and leaders require or need to have that sense of maturity, yet they need to also kind of be on the cutting edge. How do they do that? How does a leader combine all of that and drive innovation? It could be in technology, it could be in other industries, but how does a leader do that? How does a leader have all of these skills and maintain their own composure and still either be on the cutting edge or inspire their people to drive innovation?
Well, I think we sometimes assume that we understand what motivates other people. And what motivates them isn't necessarily what motivates us. I mean, we all have to, in an organization, any kind of organization, we have to have a kind of a shared mission and purpose. And most people, especially today, especially the generations coming up, to them, that's very important. They need to feel connected to the mission and purpose of the organization, which means leaders have to communicate that. So,
Mm,
even in, for example, in insurance, what are you doing? What you're doing in life insurance is making sure the family is okay, when you're gone, right? And so getting other people connected to whatever that purpose is, and then understanding their individual motivations
mm,
is a big part of it too,
mhm,
right? So, I was talking to somebody, a leader the other day who his company was about to be acquired, and I said, some of your employees are going to be upset. You know that, right? You're going to have to, talk with everybody. They're going to be motivated and mobilized by different things. He said, yeah, but we're going to become part of an international company. I said, yeah, and some of them don't care a whit about that. Right? They just want to do their jobs. And he's like, you're right, right? So what excites us isn't always what excites other people. And if we can just remember that and try to be in touch with all the individuals on our team about what's
mm,
exciting for them,
mm.
then you're going to get their best efforts, and you're going to be able to harness or set free, I'd like rather say, set free their energies to create and innovate.
And I love that you said that. It's interesting to me that this notion of setting free their energies, I love that. I love that notion. And yet you have had a similar thing just happen to you very recently, right? Your company was acquired by a global public firm. They were acquired by your company was acquired by BTS. Have they done that? How has that affected your entrepreneurial and innovative approach?
Well, I think I was very fortunate and also thoughtful about choosing a company that is entrepreneurial, even though they're large. It's a very unusual culture. And it was, I think, for both BTS and for me, that was an important consideration
Mm,
in deciding whether we got married up. Having said that, of course, when you're in a larger company, you do different things, you do things differently, right?
mhm,
And
mhm,
so, as far as understanding what motivates people, I think it's still important. Although I've certainly had the privilege of working with leaders who have been, engaged in M&A, there's nothing like going through it yourself to fully appreciate the impact that it has on people. And, it's even more important in situations of change, whether that's an acquisition or any major shift
mm.
that you're making. And most companies are going through a major shift to reconnect with people because you're going to be surprised. You're going to be surprised at how they feel about it and what challenges they feel. Some people love change. Some people hate change. What would make them happy. We're full circle back to something we talked about at the very beginning. That, if we don't really understand people and if we aren't resonant with them, um, we're not going to be able to have a happy organization.
And without a happy organization, innovation and creative drive are going to fall. That's going to be one of the first things I imagine that would fall off.
Yeah,
Suzanne, this has been such an amazing conversation, and I would love it if you would just give us where people can find you, because I know if you're listening to this, you want to find out more about Suzanne Bates and the work she's doing. So, Suzanne, if you could give sort of your website and your social channels so that if somebody wants to connect with you, that they can.
thank you. That's a lovely offer, Isolde. Thank you. You can find me on LinkedIn, Suzanne Bates, and you can find me on the BTS website, at bts.com, but there's a lot more information about the things we talked about today on the website that's still up, which is the Bates website, bates-communications.com. And if you're interested in the books, all four are on Amazon: Speak Like a CEO, and the newest one is All the Leader You Can Be.
Ooh, we didn't talk about that, and I'm definitely going to put all of those links on the show notes so you're going to be able to find them there as well. Suzanne, I'm so grateful that you took the time to talk about this, and especially moving forward into this uncertain, in some ways, future. It's really good to hear that you're working with leaders to help them embrace it and also develop cultures in their own organizations that will swim instead of sink. So I'm I'm so grateful for you and for the work you're doing. I have just one other quick question to ask you, and it's a silly question, but I find that it yields some profound answers. And the question is this: if you had an airplane that could skywrite anything for the whole world to see, what would you say?
Mm, what a lovely question. Live today.
That's beautiful. I love it. I love it. What a wonderful sentiment. Absolutely. This is it. This is what we've got right now, the presence. Suzanne, I'm super, super grateful that you took the time and you left so much wisdom in this episode. I'm so thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it.
It's my privilege and my pleasure, Isolde. Thank you very much for championing the cause of innovation and for reaching so far afield to find people to talk about it with you. I'm very grateful. Thank you.
Oh, it was all my pleasure. This has been Suzanne Bates and Isolde Trachtenberg, and this is the Innovative Mindset Podcast. If you're liking what you're hearing, tell a friend, especially about this episode. You need to tell a friend to listen to this, especially if that friend is a leader. Until next time, once again, this is Isolde Trachtenberg reminding you to listen, learn, laugh, and love a whole lot. Thanks so much for joining me today. I really appreciate you being here. Please subscribe to the podcast if you're new. And if you like what you're hearing, please review it and rate it and let other people know. And if you'd like to be a sponsor of the show, I'd love to meet you on patreon.com/innovative mindset. I also have lots of exclusive goodies to share just with the show's supporters there. Today's episode was produced by Isolde Trachtenberg and is copyright 2021. As always, please remember this is for educational and entertainment purposes only. Past performance does not guarantee future results, although we can always hope. Until next time, keep living in your innovative mindset.